We are as we were, just about, but we're not with Paddy Ashtown, but we have something better, and that is the brilliant Tony Gosling joining us from the United Kingdom. Hi, Tony, how are you?
Hi, Pippa, fine, yeah.
Good.
Raring to go.
Good. We've got a lot to get through today, and I think we're going to start, not at the beginning, we're going to start at the middle. It's just one big circle anyway, isn't it? So let's start with the news last week that NatWest were moving on the bank accounts of a broadcaster that comes onto the British television.
Yeah, that's Russia Today. Interesting, isn't it, that you've got what is now still officially anyway, a nationalised bank, that is the Royal Bank of Scotland, which owns NatWest, actually acting for the government, effectively against another state, which is Russia Today, effectively is a state broadcaster. When I worked for the BBC, I was effectively a civil servant. So this is, I think, a bit of a sneaky way for the government to wash their hands of the whole thing and say, oh, it's nothing to do with us, but they're getting private businesses to make what is effectively a very important diplomatic move, trying to kick the Russian state broadcasters out of Britain. So they're being they're trying to do it in a very sneaky way by getting the private bank, which is effectively, although it's run as a private bank, it's owned by us, to do this dirty work for them.
Now, Russia Today is a channel which I suppose many people will find hard to swallow because it is straight out of Moscow and it is state-run. Nevertheless, there are...
Well, like the BBC is straight out of London. Absolutely. And state-run. Now, when I worked there, I would say that there were quite a lot of checks and balances to make sure that we were guaranteed as an independent broadcaster. I know, for example, if you know about universities, you get to what's called tenured professorships. That means that if you start saying things which upset politicians, you can't be removed as a professor. We had a similar kind of guarantee with the staff contracts at the BBC, which meant that if you upset the government or did a broadcast which annoyed them, that they couldn't then just come and bully and remove you. Now, of course, there were techniques that they used to use to do that. But increasingly, those guarantees have been eroded over the last 20, 30 years. Really, the 1990s was the last time that the BBC was in any way properly independent.
We saw, maybe 6 or 7 years ago now, that Press TV, the Iranian news television channel, was shut down.
Well, it wasn't shut down. Let's just be, specific terms here. It was banned in Britain. So when I go on Press TV, which I do once or twice a week, to talk about things like the Snoopers Charter, the warnings from the Second World War that we have to make sure that governments aren't allowed to do mass profilings of the population. That's what the Nazis did, of course, in the 1930s, profiling communists, trade unionists, Jews, etc., in order to stick them in the little box and say, right, we're going to get these guys later. That's what they're now doing here in Britain on a massive scale, far bigger than the Nazis did. So when I say that kind of stuff on Press TV, anyone in the world can listen to it pretty much, except here in Britain. That's the irony. It's been banned here.
That's right, it was banned there, and thank you for correcting me there. It certainly is still accessible. You've actually had, you've been on RT yourself, haven't you, as well?
Yes, quite a lot. Not so much recently. I think that because there's moves towards war, I mean, we're seeing more and more confrontations between Washington and Moscow. They are deciding, like, we're going to play a bit of a safer line on RT. We will get rid of some of these more controversial people like myself. And in fact, there's quite a few who aren't working on RT anymore. For example, I mean, I put an article together recently which shocked me that the Canadian intelligence services were involved in recruiting for ISIS in Turkey. So that is luring usually young men and women, sometimes even teenagers as young as 15, over to Turkey, and then smuggling them down on buses down through Turkey to the border with Syria, and then passing them on. And there was a kind of line of recruitment that was being aided and abetted by the Canadian intelligence service. Now, I put that all together. It was all evidenced by Turkish police reports. And the Russia Today decided they didn't want to publish it. Now, I can understand that, really, because they are in a very, very sensitive situation diplomatically with Turkey. Now, this is a Turkish police report that's come out. The Turkish government were probably sanctioning it from the top, but the police were doing their job and investigating it from underneath, if you can see it that way. So I can see why the Russians wouldn't want to cause a diplomatic row with Turkey by publishing my article, So there is, as things ramp up with the tension, people like me who are prepared to talk straight, if you want, and not be afraid of those at the top are sidelined slightly. And I do totally understand why the Russians need to do that.
There are a number of concerns about the shutting down of the bank accounts with RT, and that is if we look at the bigger overall picture of the press in Britain at the moment, which plays an immensely proactive role in determining how the British public think, and we're seeing this quite shockingly with some of the sort of mainstream tabloid press and the screaming headlines. They were called to account actually by the European Commission on Intolerance and Racism just a couple of weeks ago about the kind of rhetoric that they're using to ramp up xenophobia in the United Kingdom. We've got to be very concerned about, first of all, that being allowed to happen, and then any voice of dissent not being allowed to be heard.
Well, look, the media in Britain is owned by just a handful of people nowadays. That's one of the side effects. And I would point to the BBC. Look, these are the people that peddled the lies in the run-up to the 2003 illegal invasion of Iraq. Perhaps they should be regulated off the air. Well, I don't think they should be, but it's a bit rich for them to start talking about RT when they have been responsible for such a hideous war crime, which has led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, the displacement of millions of people in the Middle East. And yet this lie was peddled night after night, day after day at the BBC, and the people that were peddling it, like Andrew Marr, were then promoted at the BBC. So that's really, it's totally hypocritical for them to be criticising RT. And I don't think really that the propaganda works very well, because people here in Britain still will watch RT. They'll get a different point of view, a different perspective, the perspective that they're not getting through the BBC, who are actually very pro-Zionist, very pro-Israeli. If you look at the... For example, just yesterday, I was listening to BBC 5 Live, and there's this woman called Emma Barnett, a presenter on there, and she was saying that Ken Livingstone said that Hitler was a Zionist. Well, this is just a lie. Ken Livingstone never said that. What he said was that Hitler supported Zionism, which he did. He did a deal with the Zionists, and that is just completely not on for the BBC to be.
It's not on, and it's really shoddy as well, because back then when Ken Livingstone said that, it was that one was wrestled, and it was clearly shown that he'd been misquoted.
Is being used here as part of a smear campaign, and really this is a sort of Orwellian world we're going into, where you're getting the official government version of events, government approved information, which nobody wants things to go down that road, but that's the way they're heading.
We've got this incredible British man called Ken Loach, who's been responsible over a number of decades now of producing some of the best film sort of drama documentaries about life in Britain. He is highly regarded. He is hugely appreciated, so it would seem, by all people from many different backgrounds. He's referred to BBC News as being manipulative and deeply political.
Well, it is, and they won't put points of view like mine on there, even though, for example, I'm one of the world, I hate to be too modest, but one of the world experts on the 7/7 London bombings. Ever since the early 2000s, when I was on mid-late 2000s, when I was on a BBC documentary, I've not been asked to speak about that at all, even though I can tell you from a victim's family perspective how cheated and utterly upset they feel having basically been cheated of justice, have not been allowed to ask questions about what happened to their loved ones, and also about whether or not the people responsible for allowing that 7/7 attack to take place have been either disciplined or moved or sacked. No, the situation is the people are in the same positions. In fact, some of them have been promoted. So, there are legitimate questions, and there's this thing called the rule of law. What happened after 7/7 was you got an inquest. Now, an inquest is for one single death. We didn't have one single death on 7/7. We had 52, I believe, and so there should have been a public inquiry. There's been no public inquiry. And speaking to some of the families of the victims of 7/7, they are really frustrated and annoyed that their voices simply have not been heard, their questions have not been asked, and at the inquest they were specifically told, well, you won't be able to put any questions at this inquest and you won't be represented. So what's happened is, the rule of law has been subverted from the top by the government, and that's why I think people are really kind of losing confidence in the government here increasingly, because when they get away with you would expect due process, and due process simply never happened after 7/7.
And a number of other instances where due process hasn't taken place. I mean, people are becoming quite familiar with this now, aren't they?
Yeah, loads. We're talking about Hillsborough, the child sex abuse inquiry as well. And what's at the back of that, I'm firmly of the belief that this was sanctioned from the top. You could even call it, in fact, many people have been calling it more recently, state-sponsored paedophilia, state-sponsored child sexual abuse here in Britain, and the system actually protecting the perpetrators rather than the victims. If you talk to the victims or survivors, as I do quite a bit, you'll find that they're very disillusioned with the way the report's been run. They all pretty much suspect and believe that this is a deliberate sabotaging of the inquiry, which might actually put some very powerful, important people in jail, including those who have been covering it up within the Home Office, who are supposed to be staffing this inquiry. And so that's one of the things I think is most important, really, about this child sex abuse inquiry, is that Lowell Goddard, who's been being attacked recently, was probably the only leader of that inquiry that the survivors actually trust. So it seems that the press is being used simply nowadays as an excuse to beat up on the people who are actually positive and making a difference. It looks like Lowell Goddard was resigned from that inquiry. It's not entirely clear why, but that she had some serious differences with the legal team. And the most important thing is that she wasn't able to decide who was actually staffing the inquiry. So if she can't decide that, and the Home Office are telling her you've got to have these staff who are going to be handling these witness statements of people who've been abused, and that those Home Office staff may themselves be complicit in the abuse in the past, then it's not surprising that she decided to throw in the towel.
It's really quite shocking, and it's the real stain on what's happening at the moment is the fact that these children, many of them adults now, of course, who've been pushed to one side.
Well, it's a continual abuse, effectively. So they were abused as children, and for example, they may have gone to their parents, and their parents may have tried things and they've got nowhere. They may have gone to the police and then been lied to by the police. Then they go to this inquiry. Not a single piece of evidence apparently has actually been heard as part of this inquiry. They then put witness statements in online and emailed them in, and apparently thousands of those were then lost, apparently, with inverted commas, by this inquiry team. So the inquiry itself has just been a continuation of the state abuse of these once children, now adults.
Let's move back to matters of Russia, because we've seen a Russian warship, an aircraft carrier, steaming through the English Channel just, when was it, in the early hours of this morning, last night?
Yeah, chugging through the channel.
Chugging.
Well, look, These have come from, I believe, from Murmansk, which is a big Russian base sort of east of northeast around the top of Norway and Sweden and Finland, around there. And they've been slowly chugging down. Now, of course, the Russians have decided that they're going to beef up their presence in the Eastern Mediterranean because, as you probably know, just a week before last, there was a massive drill in Russia for a potential nuclear war where 40 million people in Russia were involved in that drill as a kind of preparation, bracing themselves for a potential strike from the United States. And I don't think that this is fear-mongering or theatrics from Putin and from the Russian government. I think that they are genuinely concerned about some of the figures who are now in positions of power in the United States. I mean, particularly as we come towards the election as a kind of hiatus, a kind of no man's land where there's nobody really in power for a while. And of course, in that situation, you get the permanent government kind of taking over. That is to say, the Pentagon, the people we don't elect. You know, these are the officials that have got jobs for life, pretty much. And so they're concerned about some of the rhetoric. I mean, threats to, for example, have bomb attacks in Russian cities, also potential nuclear threats with the missile defence shield that's been assembled around Russia in places like Romania and the Baltics and Poland, these places. So the Russians are saying, well, actually, we do think you're going to attack us because all of the signs and your words indicate that. So they're getting prepared. So this beefing up the Russian fleet in the Eastern Med is countering the presence of the US Sixth Fleet, which is based in the Mediterranean, and of others. Of course, the Israelis have got these Dolphin-class submarines there, which are nuclear capable, because the Israelis have got something like 200 nuclear weapons, we believe, even though they constantly deny it. And the fleet that's come down from Murmansk could quite easily have sailed out in the middle of the Atlantic, but it didn't. You know, it's come really close by. In a way, what the Russians are doing there is they're saying, look, do you really, really want a war? And they're putting it right in our face, so you can, you know, with your binoculars or even with the naked eye, look out from Dover and see the might of the Russian Navy making its way to what is a potential zone of World War III. So they're not trying to hide things, which I think is really the most mature attitude. They're saying, look, we don't want this war, but it may have to happen, and we're certainly not hiding what we're doing. We're being absolutely open about what's happening here, which is completely the contrary to what the Americans and the British seem to have been doing. All smoke and mirrors with their support for ISIS in Syria and places like that. So I think many of us are looking at our own leadership and saying, well, look, you know, what you seem to be doing, not only with the child sexual abuse, etc., is criminal. And the surveillance, the mass surveillance, well, that was ruled this week by the Investigatory Powers Tribunal to have been illegal for the last 17 years, these mass data trawls. And who is going to be arrested? Who is going to jail for the breaking of the law by the Secret Services? The answer is probably nobody, because they have put themselves almost in an invulnerable position where they're not even properly scrutinised by Parliament. So we're pointing our fingers, many of us here in Britain, at our government and at our elite and saying, look, we've had enough of this. We want the rule of law. That's all we're asking for, is that people who've broken the law, for example, you know, when you want to put somebody under surveillance, you have to go by law to a judge and show why. And they simply haven't been doing that at GCHQ. They've just been trawling masses of data without bothering to go to the courts. So they themselves should go to jail.
Going back to Russia and Syria, of course, that being the sort of backdrop to everything that we're speaking about here, it's also very important to remind ourselves that Russia is actually in Syria legally at the invitation of the head of state of Syria, that being Bashar al-Assad.
They have been for decades. In fact, really France and Russia are probably the two biggest, I suppose, I wouldn't necessarily say friends of Syria, but the French have had an influence there for a long time. But the Russians really, all the way through the Cold War, I can remember at school talking about this, like back when we were like 15 years old, in the lunch break. Oh gosh, World War III, if it breaks out, it'll break out in Syria. And we're on this kind of road to Damascus, aren't we? Almost biblical, you know, where the Pentagon wants to smash Damascus, take it over, do a regime change, blah, blah. And yet the Russian armed forces are saying, no, you're not doing this. And we're seeing that again and again. We're being blocked from doing it. The Russians do have and have had for many decades a naval port at the Eastern Mediterranean at Tarsus in Syria. They're not going to give that up, quite obviously. And this is also connected with the Crimea, because the attempts of the Americans and the British and NATO to intervene, to have regime change in Crimea and in Syria are both really part of the same operation. They are to deny fleet bases to the Russians in Crimea in the Black Sea and in Tarsus in Syria in the Mediterranean. And the Russians are saying, by steaming this fleet down, are really saying, look, forget it. Basically, you're not going to do that. And if you're going to try and push us out, physically push us out of Tarsus, or physically push us out of the Crimea and the Black Sea, you're going to get a bloody nose.
Now, the fact is that all of this is happening, as you've quite rightly said there, the moment where there is the government is in limbo, shall we say, in the United States at the moment. But we have... well, certainly, I'm reluctant to use the word fascinating, because actually it's not fascinating. It's really just startling, the so-called presidential race for the White House, which is perhaps not so much of a race. But the fact is that we've got, let's look at the rhetoric that they've used, each of those candidates there have used regarding Putin just recently, Trump with Putin and Hillary Clinton with Putin. Trump saying that, he would quite happily be friends with Putin, although he didn't put it quite like that. And of course Hillary Clinton, I think every thinking man knows what she thinks.
Yeah, it's a bit of a freak show, Pippa, isn't it? I mean, when I look at Hillary and her sort of wild, first of all, there's this whole issue of her health. Is she actually in any kind of reasonable state of health? And there seems to have been quite a lot of attempts to cover that up. I mean, clearly she passed out at the 9/11 ceremony. She couldn't walk, Now, it wasn't a warm day, it wasn't as simple as that. And she is not in good health. She also has these coughing fits, which she's had in front of the cameras, where she sort of disappears off for half an hour and then comes back and resumes speaking. But, she's not in good health, quite definitely. And the more serious aspect of why it would be a total disaster if Hillary Clinton was to become president of the United States is her track record of war crimes. Now, go back to Seymour Hersh. He is the guy from the My Lai massacre back in the Vietnam War era, one of the best investigative journalists in the world. It was him that published the evidence that implicated Hillary Clinton in smuggling nerve gas. Now, this is WMD, the real WMD, not the pretend stuff from the Iraq invasion. Real WMD, which was used in Ghouta in Syria 2 summers ago. And we saw those horrific pictures on our television screens. But it was Hillary Clinton that allowed that to come and sanctioned it to come from Libya through the Benghazi embassy, through some of the foreign fighters that have been being secreted into Syria by the West. And then when it looked like that was all going to come out and there was going to be a disclosure of nerve gas being smuggled by Hillary Clinton secretly to Syria to try and fit up Assad, then the Benghazi embassy was then attacked. The ambassador was killed. Now, all this has come out as part of these email leaks. And much of this has just simply not been reported, even though you've got one of the greatest investigative journalists in the world, Seymour Hersh, reporting it. Nobody really picks up on this because the media is totally biased in favour of Hillary and against Donald Trump. The reason is that they elite institutions are all pulling together for Hillary because this is the permanent government taking over. Now, Hillary Clinton comes from a crime family. I mean, the Clinton crime family, and Victor Thorne had been investigating them, writing books on them for years. He then suddenly, mysteriously died a couple of months ago, along with various other people connected with the Hillary Clinton campaign, who were, for example, trying to blow the whistle on the cheating of the Democratic nomination. Now, Bernie Sanders had a massive amount of support, but they have some sort of superdelegate system within the Democratic Party where Hillary Clinton stole that nomination from Bernie Sanders, because Bernie Sanders would have created a very interesting election, as a Democratic candidate against Donald Trump. You'd have had a real choice to make. You would have also got probably tens of millions of poorer Americans voting for Bernie Sanders as a Democratic candidate. Now, of course, they won't be voting. This is part of what this is all about, is disenfranchising people, making a democracy less and less of a democracy and more of a dictatorship. And I think we're going to see Hillary Clinton stealing this election. There's already videos out. I'm not absolutely sure what the organisation is called that's putting them out, but this is just literally over the last few days. They've been like the number 2 and number 3 top trending videos on YouTube, getting millions of hits within a few days, looking at the corruption in the Clinton campaign. For example, getting agent provocateurs, people sending people into Donald Trump rallies to start violence, and then, of course, get negative headlines and publicity for Donald Trump. The other thing that is about spending vast amounts of money illegally busing people from one state to another so they can illegally vote for Hillary Clinton in another state and paying them to do it, literally bribing people. So these revelations done on hidden cameras have been coming out over the last few days. I'd definitely, maybe I could send you a link later on to one of them or to the site where they are, because these haven't been reported either. Unbelievable to see election fraud going on, criminal activity going on from the Hillary Clinton campaign to steal the election, and yet it's not reported, Pippa.
And of course the Clinton Foundation itself, the well-documented criminality that's taken place within that foundation, if you like. What's the film called? Clinton Cash, the movie, isn't it? And I would urge listeners to watch that film. It's really startling in how evident it is that the Clintons, Hillary and Bill, have been in really sort of garnering power for themselves, for the Clintons as a dynasty.
Yeah, well, it's a bit like the Bush dynasty, isn't it? I mean, what's happened over the centuries is we've got these massive families that own and control much of our countries. I mean, we're talking about land, we're talking about stock in companies, we're talking about big factories, that sort of thing. And with the families are like for example, the Rothschild family here in Europe, who are massively wealthy, so wealthy that they can pay lawyers to threaten the Sunday Times so that they go down the rich list, a bit like the Queen does. I don't know if people realise this, but the Queen should be at the top of the Sunday Times rich list. But the lawyers from the Crown Estates got in touch with a friend of mine who was working at the Sunday Times, this is literally 20 years ago, saying, look, you can't do this, and if you continue to say the Queen is the richest person in the world, then we will have to sue you. So threatening letters from the rich and powerful are very good ways of sending them down the rich list, so people don't realise just how wealthy they are. But certainly the royal family are incredibly wealthy. The Rothschild family, extremely super wealthy. And in the United States, the Rockefeller family, similarly, the Morgan family, the DuPont family. So these big families basically own our Western world. And what they do is they then sort of bring on dynasties like the Bush dynasty, I would say the Bush crime dynasty, to influence politics. We have Prescott Bush, for example, involved in a 1933 coup attempt trying to get rid of President Roosevelt, who was bringing in the New Deal, which was a sort of reaction, in a way, the sort of thing we should be seeing now as a reaction to the 2008 bailouts. The idea to get the economy going again. Roosevelt was doing it. Prescott Bush was trying to perpetrate a coup against him to stop him doing it. And so the Clinton family is a similar one. It's a relatively recent. They're I suppose you could see them as useful idiots, really, who are just prepared to do anything for power. And that's where we are in the United States at the moment. There really isn't any kind of real democracy because the media are simply not reporting the criminality from the Clinton campaign.
And it really does leave one feeling, fascinating times to be living in. There's no question about that, but it's hard to imagine coming out of this in one piece, isn't it? As a global community, it's worrying.
Well, yeah. It looks to me as if we're going to get. We've had the 2008 financial crisis, which has meant that the health service, for example, in this country has been devastated. I mean, you've got people who, a friend of mine actually, who's got stage 4 cancer. She was presenting a month and a half ago to accident and emergency, and they said, "Oh, you've got indigestion." Because they just don't have the money to deal with things. This is the Jeremy Hunt Britain we're living in now, is where they're taking away the vital resources that we need in order to survive as a people, It
seems to have picked up pace since Theresa May has taken up her position, doesn't it?
Theresa May's an interesting one, isn't she? Because she's been responsible for cutting something like 20% of the police over the last, since the beginning of the time of the coalition government. And also responsible for a total disaster and crisis in our prisons, where lots and lots of people just really refuse to work in prisons anymore because they're far too dangerous. We saw a murder in a prison earlier this week. This kind of thing is where we're going. We're a complete rundown of public services. And who takes over? Well, it's, the New World Order, if you want, the big corporations who will be taking over. It's James O'Keefe, by the way, that's been putting these videos about the Clinton campaign. Because they've been getting no publicity at all, which they should have been on the radio and on the television here in Britain. And it's called, they're a series called Rigging the Election. And the reporter is James O'Keefe. I think he might be related to Ken O'Keefe, in fact, who's quite a feisty character, former Marine. Yeah. All over the internet. Another person we never see on the BBC.
No, funnily enough, we don't, do we? Tony Gosling, I know we've taken a huge amount of your time today, but of course there's been an awful lot to talk about. But thank you, as always. Keep up the good work, and I hope that we can speak soon.
Yeah, and I recommend all of your listeners to have a look at this Rigging the Election video
James O'Keefe.
and Rigging the Election video 2, because you'll see, as there is, I would warn the listeners, there is swearing in there, so no kids around, please. Okay. But this is hidden filming.
It's funny you say that, actually, because, no kids around, because there is swearing in there. And yet, the other morning, I found myself with the television on and my son sitting next to me, and the news is on, and it's Hillary and Donald and the kind of dialogue that they're having. And I'm so conscious of the fact, how do I explain this low level of politics to my child? I think I'd rather he heard swear words, to be fair.
Well, if you listen to the words that are being used by the Hillary Clinton campaign operatives, it's almost every other word is a swear word. These people are, not the kind of people that you would want to have around your own home. Certainly not electing the person to run your country.
Yeah, says it all, doesn't it? Tony Gosling, as always, thank you so much.
Thanks, Pippa.
Bye-bye.
This is Talk Radio Europe, your voice in Spain.